I'm shooting this in March 2020 in the midst of COVID-19 pandemic. And like millions around the globe, I'm practicing social distancing and spending a large amount of time every day trying to cope with the uncertainty of this all. There are just too many unknowns and too many things that can go horribly wrong, even worse than they already are. In our isolation, many of us have turned to art and entertainment, not only to distract us, but to help us cope with these uncertain times by finding some personal or cosmic meaning in these events. This theme of humanity's search for meaning in a world filled with uncertainties and chaos has been extensively explored in cinema. One of the best examples being Coen Brothers' dark comedy, A Serious Man. Professor Larry Gopnick is a physicist at a local university whose life in 1967 is falling apart, riddled with uncertainties. He's worried about his health and is awaiting results of a medical test. At the same time, his wife informs him that she's leaving him to marry his friend, Cy Abelman, who's best described as a teddy bear psychopath. The divorce means that he may lose his house, custody of his children, and much of his money in the settlement. He's uncertain about his chances for tenure because he's being slandered to the university committee by an anonymous letter writer, while one of his students may or may not be trying to bribe him. Meanwhile, his roughneck neighbor is encroaching onto his yard and his unemployed brother is sleeping on his sofa trying to complete a probability map of the universe. In his desperation, trying to cope with the sudden explosion of uncertainty and chaos in his life, this not particularly religious man applies to a series of local rabbis for help. Larry desperately tries to clutch at straws to see some kind of meaning in his plight, but none is available. In Larry's struggle, we see telltale signs of what psychologists refer to as ambiguity aversion. In this video, we take a closer look at the definitions and history of ambiguity aversion, followed by its causes, its risks and benefits, and finally ways to manage it. If you like the video, subscribe to the channel for more videos on similar topics about human behavior. Now let's begin. Ambiguity aversion is defined as our preference for known risks over unknown risks. The ambiguity or uncertainty may arise from either missing information, insufficient understanding of the information and its meaning, or undifferentiated options that are equally appealing or unappealing. This bias is commonly observed in situations where there are moderate to high chances of a desirable outcome or low chances of an undesirable outcome. But in some situations, the pattern may be reversed and people may actually prefer uncertainty. This is due to the fact that when the probability of an outcome is extreme, that is very high or very low, then it is easier to imagine that further information will make it less extreme than more extreme. Therefore, in cases of low probability of desirable outcomes, ambiguity gives people hope that the missing information will improve their chances. And in cases of high probability of undesirable outcomes, people hope that ambiguity means that the chances are lower than they seem. Awareness about people's aversion to ambiguity has existed in all cultures and in all eras. As the old Irish proverb goes, better the devil you know than the devil you don't know. This tendency was first recorded in an experimental setup in 1961 by the American economist Daniel Ellsberg. Ellsberg offered his participants a choice between two urns, each containing 100 balls. Urn A contained 50 red and 50 black balls, while urn B contained an unknown mixture of red and black balls. A significant majority of the participants chose urn A, the one with an equal number of red and black balls, over urn B, for which they did not have the complete information. This result is paradoxical to the economic theory of rational decision-making, because a rational person or a serious man, given no further information, should behave as if the possibility for red and black balls in urn B are equal, that is 50% each, which is the same as urn A. Therefore, this person should have no clear preference between the two urns. Other studies have found that people are even more averse to real-world ambiguity, such as outcomes of elections or sporting events, than ambiguity in experimental setups. In the next section, we look at the various causes of ambiguity aversion. Causes of a behavioral bias may be either cognitive or neural. Let's start with the cognitive causes, which are the psychological mechanisms that explain the bias. Now, it is likely that no one of the multiple explanations can explain all the cases of the bias, and that each explanation is valid in some cases and invalid in others. Firstly, people fear that if they choose an ambiguous option and receive a bad outcome, then they will be criticized by others. Now, this is known as fear of negative evaluation. This fear increases with the number of people observing a decision, as well as with the perceived competence and intelligence of the observers. Next, people are motivated to avoid the regret they may experience if the outcome of their decision reveals that their decision-making was flawed. Therefore, while making decisions, we anticipate the possibility of future regret and choose options that minimizes such possibilities. This tendency is known as regret aversion. And finally, ambiguity and uncertainty can evoke a number of very different emotions based on our interpretations and evaluations of the situation. These emotions can influence our attitudes and responses to ambiguity. Uncertainty can cause anxiety if it is a barrier to effective decision making, and fear if it threatens well-being and safety. If the threat is extreme, it can cause torment and panic, and personal acknowledgement of uncertainty can cause insecurity. Living in the time of a global pandemic, we are all well acquainted with the negative responses to uncertainty. But on the flip side, people who are uncertain yet believe that a bright future is possible feel hope or optimism. And when uncertainty represents elements of both danger and opportunity, the emotional response may be thrill, which is a combination of excitement and fear, which characterizes high-risk yet rewarding activities like adventure sports. Now let's look at the neural causes of the bias, which are the brain functions or other biological functions that contribute to the bias. The level of ambiguity in choices is associated with increased activation in amygdala, which is involved in processing emotional information, and orbitofrontal cortex, which is involved in integrating emotional and cognitive inputs from other parts of the brain. While these two brain regions may be involved in the motivational and emotional components of decision-making under uncertainty, the lateral prefrontal, insular and parietal cortices may support the calculations involved in evaluating uncertain possibilities. Ambiguity-seeking behavior is associated with activation in the lateral prefrontal cortex, which is involved in the analytical component of decision-making, as well as inhibiting impulsive responses. Whereas ambiguity aversion is associated with activation in the posterior parietal cortex, which is involved in integration of inputs from other brain regions to represent the value assigned to each option in a choice. Ambiguity is also associated with reduced activation in the striatum, which is involved in risk and reward perceptions, thus lowering the anticipated reward for ambiguous options. Therefore, our brains can recognize situations where information is missing and interpret that the choices made with the available information carry more unknown consequences, some of which may be undesirable. In the next section, let's look at some of the risks and benefits of the bias. Let's start with the benefits. After all, for the bias to be passed down to us from our ancestors, either genetically or culturally, it must be beneficial at least in certain conditions. Firstly, ambiguity in most cases is subjective. So while we may not have the complete information, others may know more than us. And if we perceive others to be adversarial or competing with us, we may fear that they may have an advantage in the situation or bias the situation to our disadvantage. As many of our decisions and behaviors are embedded in social contexts, and commonly the intentions of others are unknown, ambiguity aversion may be a useful heuristic. Next, ambiguity aversion may reflect the survival pressures that influenced the evolution of our decision-making framework. From an evolutionary perspective, ambiguity becomes an existential threat as organisms need to make decisions based on incomplete and uncertain information from their environment, and their survival depends on these decisions. In our ancestral environment, the impact of ambiguity may have been lopsided towards negative outcomes. That is, choosing ambiguous options may have done more harm than good to our ancestors. Now let's turn our attention towards the risks or the undesirable impacts of the bias on individuals as well as society as a collective. Firstly, ambiguity distorts our perception of risks. For low probability risks, such as that of cancer, incomplete information can increase risk perceptions. But on the other hand, for medium to high risk probabilities, such as that of a global pandemic like COVID-19, incomplete information can lead to lower risk perceptions. Secondly, uncertainty leads to anxiety, which causes a desire for the uncertainty to be resolved as soon as possible. But in many cases, there is a significant delay between a decision being made and its outcomes being known. This expected time for resolution of uncertainty may influence decision making, as people may prefer options with swift resolution to avoid prolonged periods of anxiety. For example, given a choice between a medical test, which is more accurate but has a significant wait time for the results, and another one which is less accurate but produces results immediately, a number of people will prefer the latter. Next, people don't sufficiently think about all the options before making decisions in ambiguous situations. Now, this is known as the disjunction effect. In a study, participants were asked to imagine either of three scenarios: having passed an exam, failed an exam, or still awaiting results. They were then asked to indicate their willingness to purchase an exotic vacation. Participants in both the pass and the fail conditions were eager to purchase the vacation, but not the participants who were still awaiting their results. Now, as the preference for the vacation was unlikely to change with either result of the exam, the participants still awaiting their results should have purchased the vacation anyway, but they didn't, which tells us that they didn't think through the possibilities. Next, ambiguity aversion causes people to procrastinate their decisions or be unwilling to act if they perceive a possibility for waiting and obtaining more information. Yet, collecting information often requires foregoing immediate rewards. This tension between seeking new information and making the best decision given what is already known is called the explore-exploit dilemma. And lastly, important decisions like financial decisions suffer due to ambiguity aversion. People tend to invest and trade more in their own countries than would be expected, given the benefits of international diversification. And in the final section, let's look at some of the ways we can cope with uncertainty and ambiguity and respond to them better. An effective antidote to ambiguity aversion is curiosity. Curiosity, if strong enough, can override fear of negative evaluation and regret aversion that accompany ambiguity and uncertainty. Next, according to the appraisal theory of emotions, our interpretations and evaluations of events, rather than the events per se, determine our emotional responses. Therefore, reinterpreting uncertain situations to imagine the desirable possibilities that may result from it can lead to hope and optimism instead of fear and anxiety. And finally, a critical requirement for successfully dealing with ambiguity is behavioral flexibility. Decision makers use different strategies to cope with different types of uncertainty. Insufficient understanding is primarily managed by collecting additional information, seeking support of others who may have a better understanding, and deferring the decision till more information is available. Incomplete information is managed by making reasonable assumptions based on evidence and revising them with additional evidence when it becomes available. Conflicting and undifferentiated options are managed by weighing the pros and cons of the options. In all uncertain situations, it is advisable not to deny or suppress uncertainty, but rather to prepare to confront and avoid potential risks. And to conclude, let's look back at the story of Larry Gopnick. Larry had difficulty to come at grips with the uncertainty and chaos that life threw at him. He wanted to see some meaning in his suffering and turned to fate to see if any personal moral failings were the source of it. But as a junior rabbi counseled him, and as he remembered during a stoned epiphany, a fresh, more optimistic perspective was all he needed to turn the page on his recent misfortunes so that he could hope for and work towards a brighter future. Go watch the movie to resolve the uncertainty about Larry Gopnick's fate. And now it's your turn. Tell us how you are coping with the uncertainty that surrounds the COVID-19 pandemic. And keep hanging in there, practice precautions, and we are all going to come out of this stronger. Thanks for watching.